hello to everyone. I'm Scott Taylor, and this is Wilson Strickhausen, and we're coming to you this morning with a conversation about what today is. We're going to be releasing this on Memorial Day, so we're here to talk about Memorial Day and how we can, even in this special time of social distancing, think about and spend some time in our own lives honoring the many brave men and women over the centuries who have been part of building this country and um, building the world in which we live in many ways. So we're going to get into it today, and we invite you along for this conversation. And before we get started, we asked the band director down at Waynesville Middle School, Adam Stewart, and many of you know Adam either through Music Makers or perhaps you're in the band program down there. We asked Adam to record taps for us, that bugle call that we hear whenever we think of Memorial Day, or when I used to live up in the D.C. area, the bugle call that I heard very often at many of the military funerals that I was a part of.
That's right. Yeah.
So we appreciate Adam, pitching in and being part of this with us as well.
Mm-hmm.
So Wilson, welcome. It's so good to see you. I hadn't seen you in a long time.
I know it.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your unique perspective in all this?
Well, first of all, I am a Methodist minister and in civilian life, of course. I pastored churches. Well, I was in seminary for 3 years and then 6 years after seminary. And in 1966, I felt this, I guess you'd call it an impression or a call that about considering the chaplaincy. This was during Vietnam. And I went ahead and applied and was accepted. And as a result, I spent 26 years as an Air Force Chaplain, stationed at many different places across the world and in the States. And my experience as a chaplain really, I think, has shaped my life as a minister and theologically and spiritually, because it gave me the opportunity to work with ministers from many different denominations across the whole spectrum. And also that my job was not only just to maintain a chapel and services, but was to actually go out and visit men and women who were serving our country. And regardless of what our job was in the Air Force, we all had one mission, and that was to prepare in case war came and that we would be ready to go. And so I was there to serve the spiritual needs of our men and women. So did a lot of counseling, visitation, funerals, grief work, all of that goes along. But it was in the unique environment of the military. So it's a life that I treasured, and goodness, I retired, and it seems such a long time ago. It was 1993 when I retired, and since then I've done several pastoral duties, and of course I was on staff here for 9 years. Had the opportunity to work with you, Scott, and thank you for all your contributions. So that's about where, and I'm retired now and staying at home because the governor told me to. No, I'm doing fine.
Well, it was always a joy to work on staff with Wilson, with you as well, and we often remember those times, and you brought a lot of joy and levity and wisdom, especially to our staff, and we are better for it. I just want to ask you, we're having kind of a candid conversation here.
Yeah.
What does Memorial Day mean to you?
Well, of course, when I think of Memorial Day, to me, it's honoring the men and women who have sacrificed their lives, who have given their life that we might live here in freedom in our country. And I think, in so many ways, I think we tend to take our freedoms for granted, and then but when we're brought face to face in Memorial Day with how much what it cost others, so that we can have freedom. And so as I was thinking about this, the whole theme of sacrifice just came through my mind, of that our men and women who sacrificed their lives didn't know us personally, we didn't know them personally, but they were doing it for what they felt was a noble cause, to defend against tyranny, and to get rid of that. So I think of sacrifice and honoring those who have made that sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I always think about my grandfather on my mother's side, who volunteered service in World War II and went to the European front in that war, and came home and was part of that greatest generation, and had a bunch of kids, my mom included, and ran his own business, and throughout his whole life would never talk very much about his experience in war. There was a deep reverence that he held for that, and only just a few years before he died did he and I actually get a chance to talk about it, and I felt like I was led into just a really reverent and hallowed space with him, to just that he could share part of that with me.
Yeah.
And I was so aware of how little I understood of that, how my experiences growing up were strongly connected to the sacrifice that he and his generation had given. And yet at the same time I'd never really have understood it in a firsthand way. So I am grateful for being able to have had that experience with my grandfather before he died.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in my experience as Air Force Chaplain, I was an Air Force people, of course, and of course back then we weren't being deployed much as they are now, and the Air Force people are being deployed just along as much as Army and Marines and so forth. So as an Air Force personnel, we didn't really have that close face-to-face up in combat like the Army and the Marines do. But I could see the effects there was the separation of families when you're gone from your family for a long period of time. And I spent almost a year in Thailand away from my family. And I saw some of the pressure it put on our personnel being away from family, and then getting a letter from home saying, we're having financial problems, or our son is not doing well, and we're thousands of miles away. And this was the day before we had instant messages, and so we had to resort to get on the telephone if we could, or had to write letters. And I went through that same type of anxiety, worrying about my family and our children, which were young. So I had to deal a lot with that, with the pressure that it put on them, trying to serve our country but being worried about their family also.
So Wilson, you mentioned being deployed, serving overseas, in the days before instant messaging and cell phones and such, and you talked about letters, and I know you brought some letters from some soldiers from some different wars, and I thought maybe you could share some of those. Those are some windows into our history and into the sacrifice that these people gave.
Yeah, I think in listening to these letters, they have an eloquent and a very strong voice as to what's going on in one's mind before they face something which they know that they may never return, and they're away from family. And I selected this one from a young man who was was deployed to Afghanistan, and of course this was 2002 when this happened, and they did have instant emails and messages, but he decided to write a letter to his mom before he went into battle. His name, he was 23 years old. His name was Sergeant Josh Harapko with the 10th Mountain Division. So he neatly hand-wrote this following letter to his mother. Dear Mom, I'm writing this letter before I leave. I couldn't say what I wanted to over the phone. First, I want to say I love you so much. You are always there for me, even though I would never talk about my problems. Secondly, you gave me the options to be a man, giving me slack in the rope to try to make the right decisions. No matter what, you always believed in me, no matter how much of a punk I was to you. We are leaving for Bagram to flush out 600 Taliban soldiers from the mountains. This is the biggest battle of the war on terrorism. We already have sustained 30 casualties and 1 KIA. I don't want you to worry about me. I know you will because I'm your son. Mom, I'm not afraid to die for something that is right. I just hope that I made you proud, and if I don't come home for any reason, I just want you to know I'll always be with you. I want you to know you raised the cream of the crop. Well, Mom, I have to go now. All that I have said here are words from my heart, and I mean every last one of them. Tell Aunt Joyce I said hi, and I love her. I hope to see you soon, but if that doesn't work out, I just needed you to know how I felt. I love you and miss you. Take care of you always in my thoughts. Your loving son, Josh. Well, he did survive that combat in Afghanistan, and he died almost exactly 1 year later on March 11, 2003, when the Black Hawk helicopter he was flying crashed during a training mission at Fort Drum, New York. And shortly before he died, he decided to give his mother the letter he had written in the uncertain hours before Operation Anaconda. And she cherishes it as his last letter home. Mm. So I think that gives us a, a glimpse into what goes through someone's mind facing something like that, which I never have. So it really helps me to understand.
Yeah.
A young man, 23 years old, going into that type of situation.
Yeah, you never have, but I know you also you worked with many people who were going into those situations. You were the spiritual advisor, and you know the.
Yeah, excuse me. When I was in, of course, when I was in Thailand in 1970, which is a B-52 base, and at that time, 1970, they were not flying the B-52s over Vietnam. So almost every mission that went up, in essence, was what they called a non-threat mission. They were flying over over Vietnam. But it wasn't until 1973 when the B-52s began actually bombing North Vietnam. I was not there then, but I've talked to chaplains who were, and that was when several B-52s were lost. Mm. And those men never returned, of course. And they had to deal with that. But when I was in Germany, our base deployed to the first Gulf War. And I remember a military wife whose husband was deployed. And she met me somewhere on the base. I don't remember exactly where it was. We just kind of started talking. And she just burst into tears. And she said, "Oh, I don't know why I'm crying." But there was that fear underneath. She was trying to put on a good face and to be brave. But underneath, she was really scared of what might happen to her husband. Fortunately, we did not sustain any casualties. But it shows me the the strong emotions that are there, and that so many of our military personnel are taught to keep those emotions in check. You know, don't shed tears. But this was a military wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so I was very fortunate to be there to be a sounding post or a listening post for people who were going through this.
Mm. Yeah, I think we're all told, you know, in some ways direct and in some ways quite subtle, to keep our emotions in check around things that can be difficult to understand, bewildering, and you know, Memorial Day is that way for me a little bit. I was thinking about what Memorial Day means to me, and I was thinking, you know, the church I grew up in would always do these really big celebrations, very patriotic events when it was Memorial Day or sometimes 4th of July or another kind of day like that. You know, we'd play all the service anthems of the different servicemen and women, and flags would be waving, probably have an ice cream or watermelon social afterwards.
Yeah.
And that was one emotion, but it seemed to sometimes miss the other emotion. I can still remember, you know, they would put up on the screen you know, we had a big TV screen in the church, and they would put up there something that would say, like, you know, World War I, and then they would put beneath it how many American soldiers died in World War I, Vietnam War, and then beneath it, you know, it would say 58,200. And to me, you know, it seemed strange to be singing these, you know, really celebratory songs, and then seeing that number and realizing that's 58,000 individuals, 58,000 families, 58,000 lives that were cut short. And so I remember thinking, you know, there's something more to this than just the ice cream social and the parade.
Yeah.
And so years later, I got into Henry V, the play by Shakespeare, which is probably, I told you beforehand, one of the most meaningful, you know, writings in my mind about war. And we were talking about was it a mini-series, Band of Brothers? You'll know, Nick. Yeah, and then it had to do with World War II, I think. And Band of Brothers, that title actually comes from Henry V, from Shakespeare's play, from the famous speech that King Henry gives to his small army of Englishmen who were in France at the field of Agincourt, and they're about to go into battle against a much larger and much more mighty French army. And King Henry, in his attempt to rouse the troops, as Shakespeare tells it, gives them the St. Crispin's Day speech, and he talks about, you know, memory, and urges his troops to fight till the end, because he says, because you will be remembered, we shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he that sheds his blood with me today shall be my brother. And you know, that's where that comes from, and it's a really rousing moment in the story. And right after that, it's kind of like the Braveheart moment. You know, they pump the troops up, and then the fields, the troops storm the field, or in Agincourt, the bowmen, you know, play a big role that day. But there's another side to it that happens a few scenes later. I marked this, and then I just took this out. Yeah, just a few scenes later, at the end of the battle, they're walking through the fields and, you know, counting the dead. And then among the dead, they discover that all the little boys who accompanied the Englishmen into battle. So you had back then, you would have boys that would carry the luggage and accompany the army to the field, but they weren't fighters; they were civilians. And they discover that all the boys have been killed on the field, and and it's against the law of arms that's taken place. It's indeed a crime against humanity, it seems. And in some ways, war always feels like a crime against humanity, I guess, to me. And King Henry, says at that moment, I know not if the day be ours. He says, I don't know if we've even won this battle, even though he clearly has. But because of the destruction that follows in the path of war, he struggles to feel victory, to feel any sense of that honor, that glory, that ideal that we seem to elevate so much in the emotional language around these sorts of days.
As we carry on this conversation about Memorial Day, it's, in some ways there have been the glorification of war, but I'd like to make it clear, both of us understand that we're not here to glorify war, but I think we're becoming more in touch with how much war cost us, not just in the loss of life there on the battleground or in an airplane, but how it has affected our men and women who have come back from those conflicts. I guess in World War II, they didn't have a lot of terminology that we have today. They call it shell shock, but now PTSD and so forth. And for a while, I was visiting the VA hospital.
In Asheville?
In Asheville.
Okay.
And I would visit some of the wards, and I'd go into the long-term care unit they have there. And you begin to listen to these, I call old guys, old veterans, who are there with various health issues. A lot of them can be traced to Agent Orange that they were spraying in Vietnam. And later on, I found out at our base in Thailand, they were spraying the perimeter of the base with Agent Orange. We didn't know that. And I used to go out and visit the security police post all along the perimeter of the base, not knowing what was going on. And so there are a lot of soldiers and men and women who have come back who are long-term results of that. But then there's the PTSD, the traumatic stress of being in battle. And when I was volunteering at the VA, a guy who helped volunteer with me, name was Tom, and he didn't talk a lot when we got started. Kind of didn't have too many social skills, but we got to know one another a little bit better. He went to Vietnam when he was about 18 or 19 years old. He wasn't actually in combat, but he was a truck driver out of the motor pool. And he says that one day he was driving somewhere and he had somebody, his friend, in the passenger seat. And his truck was hit by some type of ammunition or weapon. And his friend beside him was killed right there. And so he saw that happen. He saw other instances of death. And when he came back after his tour in Vietnam, the majority of his life was spent reliving that, which resulted in several marriages, divorce, became an alcoholic, attempted suicide. He survived that, and that was, I think, was really the wake-up call for him. And he had joined a support group, which I attended with him one time. And he's somewhat put his life back together again, but still, there's only so, in his relationship with people, there's only so far he can go. And he just can't open up and really feel at home with anyone. And I thought about Tom. He's been suffering that. He's in his 60s probably, and since he was 19 or 20 years old. So that was such a visible evidence of the agony that many of our veterans are going through. Many of them have become homeless, susceptible to what's going on with COVID-19. So there's just a tremendous cost to war. And you see so many veterans there who come in with a leg gone or an arm gone. So that really, really impressed upon me how much our wars have cost us, even though it seems like that sometimes that evil has to be faced. But there's a lot of complexity in it sometimes. So. There's a lot of cost to it. And there's a famous quote I got here from, you may be familiar with this, from Robert E. Lee, who was quoted by saying, "It's good that war is so terrible, lest we grow too fond of it."
Yeah, I've heard that quote.
Boy, what a statement.
There's that just reminded me. I used to work at the National Cathedral in in Washington D.C. and as you walk out the back of the nave of the National Cathedral, there are two statues, and because the cathedral is in Washington and Washington was in that that unique geographic area of being on the very southern side of the north and on the very northern side of the south, kind of sad. I mean, really, it was the Civil War was fought out in people's homes in that area.
Yeah.
And so one statue is that of Abraham Lincoln, and behind him is an inscription of his letter to, I think, the people of Springfield when he was leaving Springfield to go be the president. And in it, he has a line, I won't be able to get this right, where he says, "I know that God goes before me and that God goes before us wherever we go." Even then, the stirrings of war were very real in 1860. Yeah. And then on the other side, juxtaposed with that, is a statue of Robert E. Lee, who was a local family, to that Washington, D.C. area.
Yeah.
Saying almost the exact same thing. I know that no matter where we go in this troubling time, God goes before us. And seeing that inside of a church, no less, was just really brought home the complexity, the challenge of war. And I was thinking, the way that I was raised to think about war, and especially more modern conflicts like the one in Vietnam, was I was raised to try to understand it from a political position maybe, or from a understanding what was the failures of Vietnam, or understanding the political kind of context that led to something like that. But when you go to the memorial in D.C., the Vietnam Memorial in D.C., and this was brought up last night in a Zoom class that I was in, that memorial isn't about any of that. That memorial is about the individuals whose lives were devastated by that conflict. The 58,000 names on that wall, and then I like how you brought up the fact that that those aren't the only lives that have been devastated. Like the boys on the field in Agincourt.
Yeah.
War touches a lot more than just the immediate casualties of war.
Yeah. So when you mentioned Vietnam, could I read a letter from a soldier that was in Vietnam?
Yes, that'd be great.
Yeah. This is from a 27-year-old first lieutenant. Name was Dean Allen, and he wrote this to his wife Joyce on July 10th, 1967. He was a platoon leader. He was a big guy, 6'1", 200 pounds, very imposing figure. And he was a platoon leader, and he was writing. He said, "Being a good platoon leader is a lonely job." And then he continued the letter the next day. And this let me share this. "It got so dark I had to stop last night. Writing like that doesn't really do much good because you aren't here to answer me or discuss something. I guess it helps a little, though, because you are the only one I would say these things to. Maybe sometime I'll even try to tell you how scared I have been or am now. Sometimes I really wonder how I'll make it. My luck is running way too good right now. I just hope it lasts. Don't worry about what I've said. These are just things I think about sometimes. I'm so healthy, I can't get a day out of the field. And I'm too damn mean to die. Sorry I haven't written more, but the weather is against me. You can't ride out here when it rains hour after hour. I love you with all my heart. All my love always, Dean. 4 days later, Alan stepped on a landmine, and he became one of the more than 58,000 Americans who died in Vietnam. Yeah. My first experience in delivering messages of death, I was a brand new chaplain in my 30s in Del Rio, Texas. And I had never had any military experience at all up to that time. I was the chaplain on duty for the weekend. So I got a call, it was on a Saturday. Said, "Chaplain, we need you to come to the command post. There's a Marine here from San Antonio that has to deliver a message." So I went over and met the Marine. He was in his dress uniform. And he said, "I'm here to deliver a message to family on base. Their son was killed in Vietnam." And he showed me the name. My heart just dropped. I had to go to the family. She was the organist in our chapel. Their son was killed in Quezon, that big battle. It was my first time to do this. So I went with the Marine, and of course, she lived on base, knocked on the front door. Of course, when she opened the door, she knew immediately what had happened. And she broke down and cried. And that was the first time I had to deal with that. And of course, I had to deal with it several times. And interestingly, I was rewatching, in preparation for this, the movie Saving Private Ryan. Have you seen that movie? No.
I have.
And one of the scenes in there that brings tears to me was when the soldier and the priest went to tell the mother that 3 of her sons, the Ryan boys, had died. And watching that, she saw them as the car drove up through the driveway, the countryside in Iowa, and she went to the door and she saw these 2 men get out. Of course, she saw the priest with the collar, and she just dropped to her knees there on the porch. Tremendous sorrow to deal with that.
Absolutely. That was based on a true story,
Yeah.
I think, right?
Yeah, 4 Ryan boys, brothers. 3 of them were killed in battle, and of course the message of the film is that this patrol was sent to bring back the one remaining Ryan brother, Saving Private Ryan. So,
well, I've been thinking as we've been talking, and I just, maybe we both can respond to this. I don't know if I can, but I'll ask you at least. Why is it important that you think we as a people, as a Christian people, as citizens, why is it important that we remember? Do you think?
Well, again, this idea of sacrifice is running through my mind, that I'm enjoying freedom today because someone sacrificed their life for me in a war. But that's not the only sacrifice that has been made for me. We're all indebted to people who have made sacrifices for us. I know my parents sacrificed that I could go through college. And we can think back into our lives of people who have sacrificed their time, their energy. They've given up things that we might have something. Of course, giving up someone's life is the ultimate sacrifice. So as I think about that sacrifice that gives me freedom, then it motivates me to live my life in a way that I can sacrifice it for the good and the freedom of someone else. So that's what resonates with me as I think about Memorial Day. And of course, I can't help but make the connection with the with Jesus' sacrifice for us on the cross to set us free spiritually. And setting us free spiritually through his death gets me off of myself. Instead of turning inward on myself, I'm enabled to turn outward to serve others. Does that make any sense to you?
It does. I like that, and I think what I was thinking as I pondered this question that just bubbled up to the top was, I think there's a lot of people out there who feel forgotten, and in my mind I have the image of someone, sitting on the side of a sidewalk with one of those hats on, that we see as people who served overseas, and sometimes and you said, they're really plagued by homelessness and many other things, and I know that they it's possible that they think everyone's forgot about them, forgot about what they went through, what they were either lucky enough or unlucky enough to have survived, and I think it means a lot. It means a lot for anyone to know that they're not forgotten, to know that there are people who remember them, who are grateful, for what they've given.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, Wilson, would you close us out with a time of prayer?
Yes, I'd like to read this before I say prayer. It's kind of a, let's see here. Oh, yeah. For all those who served, shed blood, and died, that we may live in freedom, united in hope and future peace, we salute and thank you most humbly with our love and prayers now and forever. May God's grace hold you in his loving embrace for all time. Well, Lord, we do give you thanks for all the men and women who have given their lives that we might enjoy our freedoms today. For those veterans who are still living and suffering, how we pray for them that they may find the resources they need to put their lives back together again. Help us as a church to respond to the needs of all as we think about those who feel like they are forgotten. May we live with a great sense of humility, a great sense of gratitude for those who have given their lives and suffered, that we may enjoy our freedoms today. Enable us now to live in love and grace and sacrifice, that others may also know freedom. In your holy name we pray. Amen.